So without further ado, I'd love to welcome onto the stage the internationally acclaimed award-winning director, Clare Lewins, Mariam Ali and Hana Ali. Before we begin, I'd just like to say I watched the film last night and I loved it. I was so touched right from the very beginning, right from those first pieces of audio that you hear, those first images that you see, and it's moving. It's Ali, but in a way that we haven't seen him necessarily on screen. There's been a lot of films. What makes this different?
You want to go first? No, you go. I think that this film, obviously, Claire took a very personal approach, and so much has been done on our father, but no one's ever actually really focused on him as the man and the father. And she focused a lot on his family, his children, and that aspect, and then on top of that, she used a lot of footage to tell a story that most people take for granted that they've heard or learned, but we were watching footage that we had never seen before, and different stories in the film. We didn't know what went on behind the scenes, like the Esquire shoot, the famous shoot that he had. So we learned a lot, and May.
I mean, like Hana said, all the documentaries of my father have been about the sport, social activism. This documentary covered all those things, but he has 9 children, and he adores all 9 children, and most journalists and filmmakers really don't tap into that. So I just think it's a real comprehensive expression of him, and it really exudes his personality, his spirit, his soul. It just comes right off the screen. So a lot of people, what they get out of this film, it's been surprising that grown men will come out crying, saying, wow, the relationship between the father and the daughter, or the father and the child, is like nothing I've ever seen about an athlete. So Claire did a phenomenal job.
Claire, why did you choose to do this job? How did the wheels get set in motion? How did it come about?
Well, a while ago I did a series for the BBC about the best friend of people like Che Guevara and Muhammad Ali and Mick Jagger, and I always thought out of all those people there was something really special about Muhammad Ali, just really surprising. And I just thought if I could actually get to the people who knew him really well in the inner circle, I could maybe find out what makes him so special.
And am I right in thinking that this all sort of began out of his birthday party, his 70th birthday party?
Well, I met Gene Kilroy, Ali's former business manager, as part of the series for the BBC, as I described, but he's then said, well, Muhammad Ali is going to be 70, and why don't you come over and film his birthday party? And yeah.
She was actually working on the film a lot longer than that. That's when I met her, and that's where I did my first interview with her. And she filmed, I think she interviewed me 3 times, and that was the first one, and that's when she was introduced to the audio recordings. But I think 75% of your film was pretty done, wasn't it?
Well, I'd actually, by then I'd sort of been interviewing people like Mike Tyson and George Foreman, but the audio recordings were something I discovered that Hana had.
So you didn't realise that the audio recordings existed?
No, I was making the film without that anyway, because I thought if I could just get to the inner circle, then I'd have a different perspective. Mm-hmm. And the sort of the audio, but one thing that I really felt was important was to have Muhammad Ali's voice present through the film. And when I found out that you had this audio recording, that became me. No, I know, but it wasn't an easy fish to land, believe you, me. Trying to persuade her to let me use some of them.
I had all these visions, I was going to make a documentary. I'm working on a book, because there's like 90 hours of recordings that span like 6-7 years when he stopped boxing. So it was hard giving him up at first, but she showed me a clip of what she was doing, and it was done so beautifully and so well, and it had so much feeling and heart and just the spirit of my father in that little clip. I thought it was amazing. So
your audio recordings make up what I would say it's kind of the spine of the film. And it's interesting because when I first saw them sort of coming onto the screen, you don't even realise that there's no moving pictures, there's nothing to see, because you're so engrossed in his voice, it's so impacting. Do you remember that from growing up, him having such command in his voice? Yeah,
I mean, my dad loved to tape and record us. I mean, he was fascinated by time and how fleeting it was, and history, and I mean, for him to be such a worldly figure and to really understand the importance of small moments with his children. And so I remember almost every recording in the film. I saw, oh my God, I remember that conversation with him. So we knew he loved that. He loved history, personal history.
He recorded us going to school and talking to the teachers when we were in third grade, Layla and I, and talking to the boys we had crushes on. He recorded my mom on the telephone talking to his mother and his father, talking about his childhood and talking, recording. He just recorded everything, just it was amazing.
Do you remember him recording? And did you ever ask why? Did you know why?
I remember there's recordings of myself, at 2 and 3, and saying, "Let me hold that thing, give me that thing," and trying to snatch it out of his hand. Or I want you to take this upstairs and let my mom hear me talking on this thing. So I remember certain things, but it was amazing to then have him give them to us and to listen to them and learn about all the other things that were going on in his life personally around the times we were just 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, playing around him on the floor, the things that he was struggling with, the decisions to come back to fight again, and trying to free hostages in Iran. The government's calling him because his name opened the lines of communication to the hostage crisis in 1979, and he's trying to prepare his speeches to the Ayatollah Khomeini to free the hostages, and he's recording all of that. He's recording, talking to different celebrities and playing practical jokes on different people, calling Joe Frazier, wishing him a happy Merry Christmas, and trying to convince George Foreman to come out of retirement, which he retired after he lost my father depressed, trying to convince him to come back to the ring and fight under him at his camp that he was trying to, all the plans he had for himself before the Parkinson set in. So it's amazing to hear all of that stuff that I didn't know about. Yeah.
So it's very good that he recorded all of that. As well as the recordings, we have a lot of archive footage, lots of personal pictures. How long did it take to gather all this together to create the film?
Well, it took a long time actually, because there was just so much of it, and the editor and I would just sit and watch stuff, and then we'd forget that we were meant to be working. We were just like watching loads of footage of him and how incredibly funny he was, and how incredibly sometimes really brash and just incredibly naughty some of the time. And the things he'd be saying to the other boxers and things he'd be saying behind the scenes. But every time, it doesn't matter how good the interviews are. There's some really fantastic interviews in the film, which has nothing to do with me. It's just the people were good. But every time Muhammad Ali comes on the screen, you just want to watch him. I mean, he's just a compelling. Yeah. So actually, it took longer than it should have done, because we were enjoying the process.
I remember she told me it was 3 hours at one point. She was like, "Oh my God, we have to edit this down. The movie's 3 hours long."
It was. I just didn't want to. And then the directors are really weird people anyway, and you just think, "Oh, it's perfect like this. Don't let's change anything." So we had to be quite ruthless and take things out. And we actually was, not taking out some quite important people from the story, because we just had to. You couldn't sit in the cinema for 3 days.
And as a voyage of discovery and still finding all of this new material that you could throw into it, presumably that made it difficult to storyboard, because you don't necessarily know what you're working with from the outset.
Well, when I was interviewing the people, I just wrote down, okay, this is the trainer's story, this is the manager's story, and I just did that as a shorthand in my notebook. And then I thought, actually, this works as a device because it simplifies everything rather than it just being talking heads. And every person I interviewed, it's almost like in the edit, they had to hand the baton over to someone else. So somebody like Angelo Dundee would describe what he was like as a boxer and how he would, he just loved to work hard, and that, youthful exuberance of him. And that would pass on to someone else who'd tell you something else. And then it would pass on to May May, who told him what he was like as a father. So in a way, the film kind of just created itself.
The flow isn't necessarily even chronological all the way through, but you're right, that sort of flow, it's all about character. It's all about how the dynamics of his character. Was there anything that you did discover that you hadn't known before?
I mean, the story, the backstory behind the Esquire magazine, where he's posed as a martyr, a Christian martyr. I didn't know the backstory on how they had to call Elijah Muhammad to get permission for a Muslim to pose as a Christian. That was funny to me. I remember that the book cover came out in '68 when I was born, and I remember the cover. I loved it, but I didn't know the backstory. So, and more details about the meeting Jim Brown when he gathered all the black athletes. So when my father refused going to the Vietnam War, they wanted to know if he was sincere in his convictions, and they had a meeting. And I knew about the meeting, but Jim Brown talked more in detail about, because I didn't know that they were trying to see if he was being sincere. I thought they were automatically supporting him. And then, through Claire's film, I found out, they were testing him to see if he was sincere about being a Muslim and not going to Vietnam. So those two things were something new for me.
I want to ask you a little bit more about growing up with your father in the limelight, and also about whether you remember him losing his crown because he refused to go to the Vietnam War. But first, we have a clip to play, the father's story, which is apt, very apt. Now, the two of you obviously have different mothers, but Muhammad Ali was very keen for you to know each other, to be brought up knowing each other. How did that work?
Well, every summer he flew, all of our sisters in to our house in Los Angeles where Layla and I lived. And Mia, Kalia, the twins, Jamila Rashida, May, Muhammad Jr., everyone flew in. And I mean, it was like the time of our lives. So Layla and I were like 3, 4, 5, 6, we grew up in the summers. So he made it a point that it always taught us to love each other and that he loved us all equally. And he wanted us to grow up to be friends. And we did. Because he brought us together.
Yeah, they always talk about athletes and all those, the kids and different women. And I just think, for him to be such a world traveler, an iconic figure, for him to that was so important to him, for all his children, with all the different wives. So he would say, this is your blood, love your sisters and brothers. I know families that they have their whole sisters and brothers, or they're not even that close. So, I mean, just things like that. He just, and some of the, the wives didn't like each other. I mean, but he didn't want us to be involved in that. And that was so important for all 9 children to really love each other. And we all do. We're all friends. We all get together. We hang out. So I think that's remarkable just as a man to find that so important. And it wasn't easy. I mean, he was married 4 times, so it wasn't easy to do, but he did it.
But most people don't know this. My father has 2 half brothers. He has 1 full brother, and he just discovered that himself in the 90s when he went to his father's funeral. And it's what he didn't want to happen to us, to grow up one day and find out we had a sister or a sibling that we don't know. Right. So, it's sad that it had to happen to him. But he found out he had 2 twin brothers that they were twins, but they were by his father and another woman. And he only learned of their existence, like I said, is when he went to his father's funeral. So that happens a lot. People have, the mothers don't want you to come together, and they don't want the kids at their house. My mother was always very opening and welcoming. She didn't meddle and cause any problems, with him and his family, other families coming and just bonding with her children. So that was good.
Claire, you very much present Muhammad Ali as a father figure. That's probably, I thought anyway, the most prominent way in which he is depicted, and in a way that we've never really seen before. Did it ever jar for you as a child, this idea that he is your dad and he's incredibly loving? You say throughout the film he's so loving, he was so caring, he was a joker, he was a practical joker. But you knew the reason he was famous was for fighting. Was that ever a confusing notion to you?
Fighting is a sport. It's a sport. You learn it. It's a skill set. So it's a dignified sport. It's no different than football. When they get injured and concussions and, they're killing themselves at the end of a career because they're all messed up. So my father used to hate when people demonize boxing because he would say, look at race car driving. People blow up in cars. So it wasn't confusing. He was a very serious, disciplined athlete.
And not just...
vicious fighter,
Not just that, but some people enjoy fighting and hurting people. My dad doesn't. Yeah. He wasn't known for being a hard hitter or hitting people when they fell down. Like the most, memorable punch of one of his most famous fights with Joe Frazier and Zaire is when, I'm sorry, not Joe Frazier, George Foreman, is when he was going down and he didn't hit him again, Yeah. So he used restraint, and he was a boxer. I wouldn't call him a fighter. He was a boxer. He had an art form to what he did. But like Layla, for example, enjoys fighting. She's retired now, but she enjoyed fighting. My father was more about the art of the sport.
Yeah. And also like Joe Frazier, we know him personally, teddy bear guy. George Foreman, nice guy.
Sweet,
Kenny Norton, nice guy. Matter of fact, Hana's best friends with Kenny Norton's daughter, and we're all good friends with George Foreman's daughter. And they were really big boxers who were very sweet men, but they just loved the sport
to hug
they
and
were
kiss.
in.
I mean, most men have a problem showing that side of their affection. My father, he'd make me ask for directions before I'm lost. He's
He'll
always
cry
hugging
at the drop
and kissing
of a
and
dime.
loving, even with his son. So he's not shy. He's not embarrassed
Very
by it.
emotional.
He's very secure with himself and showing all aspects of his personality and his spirit.
And at what point did you realize growing up? Did it hit you? My dad is kind of a big deal.
I knew he was famous when I was a little girl because people were everywhere and celebrities would come to the house and all that. I didn't understand the significance and the impact he had on people until around 13. We were at a diner. Caucasian man comes up to the diner. I love you, Ali. My father said, come on, eat with us. He said, I had to denounce what my family taught me because they were KKK, racist, and I followed your career and I loved you and you were a black man. And I just couldn't believe in that anymore because of you. And man started crying, my dad started crying, I started crying. And the guy walked away, and I'm like, wow, you really impact everyone. I mean, that's when I knew he was more than just a boxer, was that moment in time. I was like, and then, people walk up to us all the time and say what Muhammad Ali meant to them. And sometimes it brings us to tears.
Or people just come, when I was a little girl, my first memory of my just being impressed was when I was like 3 or 4, maybe. And we spent a lot of time in airports, and my father would be rushing down the airport in the halls trying to catch our plane, and all the people would just stop and applaud. And I remember feeling them vibrating in my chest and them saying, "We love you, thank you," and just thanking him. And I'm thinking, who is this man? I remember looking at him and just thinking, like looking him up and down.
Talking of crying and getting emotional, Claire, were there any times when you were interviewing the contributors for this film where you found yourself overcome by the story, by what you were hearing?
Well, I think there's a story when Jean Kilroy talks about the boy with leukemia who was at Deer Lake, Pennsylvania, a little boy that came to the camp. And Jean told me that story before, but then he found the actual photograph of the little boy, and that, I can't even want to talk about it, it's just so unbelievably poignant, the fact that the little boy was so delighted to meet your father and, told him he was going to tell God he'd met him and everything. It was just really sad. Yeah. But also, I think I was blown away by, even people like Marvis Fraser. Now, if he's got any reason to have a beef with your father, because of the whole history, the whole bad backstory, and yet when he was saying, they came together and sort of, at the end, made a friendship, and that was really moving, really, because it's out of that enemy, they resolved it.
A lot of people didn't know it was one-sided. My father always loved Joe Frazier, so he did what he did with all the fighters. Only Joe Frazier took it to heart when he was trying to publicize and boast the fights, promote the fights. Joe Frazier and his children had a hard time, and when he found that out, it just brought him to tears, and it really broke his heart. So for a long time, Joe Frazier would shun my father and would turn his back on him. I remember when I first learned of it, I was like 14 or 15 years old, and they were at an autograph signing, and my dad saw Joe, his eyes lit up, he jumped up, Joe, come over here, like he tried to start shadowboxing, and Joe Frazier looked at him and just sort of, and kept walking, and I turned to my stepmother and said, why did he do that to Daddy? So that's when I first learned about that, and then later my father found out that he was really hurt by what happened, and he literally just put his head down and cried.
There's that beautiful image of the two of them hand in hand when they'd made up. My personal emotional moment was pretty much at the beginning of the film. I was lost cause after that. Rahman Ali, his brother. What a beautiful relationship. He talks about how they grew up together, how they were so close as little boys. And it's the beginning of the story of this 12-year-old boy, this 87-pound 12-year-old boy who had his bike stolen and decided he wanted to fight to get it back. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but we've got a clip of the brother's story.
The executive director.
Well, that was the black athletes meeting.
That wasn't actually the brother. I think they may have logged that down like sort of like civil rights brother. But
brothers as a group. But that actually does take me on to talk about when he was stripped of his title. He refused to go to the Vietnam War. Do you remember that?
Well, I was born at that time. I was born when he was in exile, so I don't remember that because I was just too young. But I've studied it. I've talked to him about it, and I think that's one of the main reasons he's so well known. I think that's when he really went international because that news went everywhere, went abroad. He was this Muslim in America, in the Nation of Islam at the time. There are Muslims all over the world, so it really put a spotlight on this country, America, and my dad and what was going on with that. So I think that was his first international real mark, when people start knowing who is this Muhammad Ali person who's defying the American government, and that he was put on the map when that happened. He didn't do that to be put on the map. He really was going to give up. And I think that's another thing, the fact that he was going to give up a potential fortune, his career, his title, because of that belief system. A lot of people hated him for it and still do, but a lot of people adored him for it.
And he actually did give it up because for 4 years, 3.5 years,
but it
he had
been
nothing
permanent
and didn't know, especially in those times, that they were going to overturn it.
But actually, one of the
here
things
right
I'd like
now.
to say is that he was incredibly fond of Britain. I mean, because when he refused the draft and everything, I mean, not me, 'cause I wasn't, I was, well, I probably was a thought, but, you know, the British people stood by him and didn't actually, they still kept his heavyweight champion, and, you know, they didn't take that away from him. So I think he was always incredibly fond of this
they
country,
really love
wasn't
me
he?
there. Every time I come there, they receive me so well. He loves it.
After that first time when there's a part, apparently he talks too much for British people. We weren't too keen on that, but we got used to it. You picked out one particular fan, one British fan, a Geordie man, I like that, from Newcastle, Russ Rutledge.
Yes, he was just extraordinary. Basically, the story of Russ was when he was about 16 years old, he came to the Albert Hall. And I think your father was in a show match or something. And as your dad was leading the ring, he grabbed hold of his arm, and your dad said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just such a fan, I'm such a fan." And after that, he wrote to him every day for years and years. And one day, he put his telephone number on it. And then he was at home with his mum and his friends, and they were watching a pirated copy, which I shouldn't say, in front of people from Universal. But anyway, a pirated copy of Rumble in the Jungle. And his mum goes, "Russ, it's Muhammad Ali on the phone." And she thought he was just messing around. And then she said, "No, it really is him." And then he said, "Oh, guess what? I'm watching you on Rumble in the Jungle." Yeah. And your dad said, "Who won?" Which I thought was quite funny. But and then he invited him to go and stay with him in LA. And that footage that he took Russ, he's never shown anyone before. It's 30 years old, and that's in the film, so that's all completely brand new archive, really.
He did that a lot, actually. If you were a fan and you sent my father your number, he would call you back. He got hung up on a lot, so he stopped telling people who he was. He actually records it. Like, he would wake up on Christmas, and he's Muslim. He doesn't really celebrate Christmas, but he knew the world did. So he would get out his phone book and just pick a random numbers. "Merry Christmas! This is Muhammad Ali," and people would just hang up on him. I remember.
I would do that too.
He loved it. Yeah, he loved it. He loved to shock people and make them feel good. So, I mean, he did that for a long time, and it got harder for him to speak over the years. So he'd have me dial the numbers. So when I was in Michigan with my dad, we were going through his fan mail. He's like, "Call the number back," and I'm like, "Hello, this is Hana Ali. My father's here. He's reading your fan mail. He'd like to say hi to you." I'm like, "Are you kidding me?"
It's amazing how famous he was and how often he was recognized. But that always tripped him out. People noticing him. Like, we'll be in the car and he'll just put the window down and say, "Look at this." He got a kick out of that. He just thought it was the funniest. He liked to shock people and, to scare people, and he'll put the window down. "I'm the greatest." This one guy's riding a bike next to the limo, and he pulls the window. He goes, "I'm the greatest." Guy's like, he's like, "Oh Lord, I almost hurt that man."
Even now, with all of the press about him dying, he doesn't get upset about that. He just says, "Did I make the front page?" So he's happy the world still talks about him.
He's doing good.
They still remember me. I'm like, "Of course, they'll always remember you."
One thing that Russ says that really stands out is you spend one moment with Muhammad Ali, and it stays with you forever. That one moment, no matter how short it was. I mean, to what extent, and how does a man have that impact?
Well, my father genuinely loves people like he needs air to breathe, and he loves making people feel good about themselves. It doesn't matter who you are, our cook, the mailman. "You're the greatest mailman. You deliver mail faster than anybody else in the world." That's what he would tell him. Or, "You're the best cook. No one in the world cooked me the food this good." If he goes to a crowd, he always looks for the people that look like they're shying, and you might not notice. And he points them out, and he'll wink, and he just loves people.
You can meet people today, and someone may be a different class than you, and you can tell they're not paying attention to you. They're looking over you. But my father gave you his attention. He didn't care, if you were rich or, if you came up to him, he looked at you and dealt with you. And you just, even today, we're on our cell phones, or we're so connected, but we're so disconnected. And I think that's what he meant. He connected with everyone.
He always made you feel important. And
he didn't overlook you because you weren't.
And he loves average people.
Yeah.
When he used to go, my mother's always talking about how when they were traveling the world, going to Bangladesh or, wherever, all over the world, and they'd be eating with the president or the prince or the king or whoever, and Daddy would just disappear in the middle of the dinner, and then they'd have to look and find him all over the palace. He'd be, where the help was, or he'd be doing magic tricks for the staff, So he just wants an average person. He always wants to be taken to the neighborhood so he can get out and walk the streets and shake
Clare
people's hands.
shows that well.
Yeah,
I thought that was really nice. That I don't think on all the documentaries he did that all the time, and no other documentary showed how he would want to. Well, back then we didn't call them hoods, we called them ghettos. He'll be with the high and mighty all day and go, "I'm tired of all these rich people. Take me to the ghetto. I want to see my people." And you captured that, in the film. And I was like, wow, Clare put that in there. It's great.
Even James Brown talks about it a little bit. How
Jim Brown
talks about it, how he wanted to go down, to black neighborhoods or wherever the people are, just talk to the people in the street.
You obviously can grasp the sort of praise that has been made about your father over the years. But when you hear a quote such as "one of the greatest men of the 20th century, one of the greatest men of all time," is that ever something that can really sink in about your dad?
He would say the greatest, not one of. No, yeah. Well, we grew up hearing it and knowing it, and we know why. A lot of times people, are idolized and revered and respected for the wrong reasons, I think. And I think that people love and respect him for the right reasons. The decency of him, the person that he was, his heart, his incredible faith, and his, his conviction, and they're all the right reasons. So it's easy
in
to.
private, he'll go, Allah's the greatest, God's the greatest, and we know he's a man, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We know, we understand why he's so admired, but at the same time, we know he's not Superman, so we don't take it too seriously. Hana, it's so interesting. I did a children's book of my father, and Hana works with autistic youth, and I went to her class and did a book presentation, and one of her coworkers is taking pictures with us, and I'm like, Hana, your coworker, they don't know our dad's Ali. She's like, no, we've worked at places and didn't even tell people who we were because we don't think like that.
I learned my lesson working at a school, because the last school I worked at, I couldn't get down the hallways afterwards. The kids, So,
I don't tell people, even though I'm here before you and I'm comfortable doing this, I just like to see who people are. And
but when I was a little girl, I went around shouting it.
Yeah.
My daddy's Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, I never did.
But he would sit us down and say, the world's going to treat you better. They're going to treat you special, but you have to remember that nothing makes you better than anybody. Not this house, not the money, not my fame. It's just your heart. So if you want to be better than anyone, make sure you have a good heart. So he taught us that. Layla and I used to go and get our $5 or whatever, and try to look for homeless people because we saw him doing that and buying them food, and and I never understood why they wouldn't eat it. But later, we just bought them cheeseburgers. They're still there at the bus stop. But he was such a great role model because he's such a decent human being. And like she said, he always says the world thinks he's Superman, but he's not. He's just a man. And now he has Parkinson's, and he thinks that's God showing everyone that he's just a man like everybody else. And I think that he's just so extraordinary that people sometimes put him on this pedestal. And even in the way he handled his faults, he wasn't faithful. He had kids out of wedlock, but he didn't hide us, or, all of his divorces were settled out of court. He was more than generous with his wealth, and he brought us together. He didn't hide anything. He faces the music. That's a wonderful thing about him too, and the way he handles his faults. You learn a lot about a person.
Throughout the film, all of the interviewees use this phrase, this recurring phrase, "born for greatness," as though it's inherent, it's there from the outset. He had a purpose. He has a purpose on this earth. A lot of the films that you've done, Che Guevara, Audrey Hepburn, for example, you're looking at these huge characters who it's almost as though their lives could, Hollywood couldn't write it. They were made to be in a film. Is there something that attracts you to these characters in particular?
Well, it's just certain people that you just think, well, if you were in China or India or someone like that, you would recognize their face, like Che Guevara or Muhammad Ali or even Steve McQueen, perhaps. Yeah. And I just wanted to find out whether those people were just got lucky. And so I thought, or were they really special? And so with your father, and the more I got to listen to those tapes, and the more I got to know about him, the more special I thought he was. And somebody said, did you discover what made him special? And I didn't really, because he loves doing these magic tricks all the time, but he used to tell people how to do it. But with Muhammad Ali, with all the stuff I've done, with all the research, I still can't put my finger on it. He is just special.
He got kicked out of the Musicians Union because he would show the tricks, because he doesn't believe in trickery. So even to us, he would perform a trick, and then he always has to show you how it was done.
He was in the Magicians Union.
Well, he bought so many tricks, and on Hollywood Boulevard, he joined it. He loves magic tricks, but always shows you how it's done afterwards.
He's fascinated by how easily people were deceived. So after he did the trick, he'll do a sermon, go, see how easily you are deceived? Watch the world. The world will deceive you. The world is an illusion.
Vivian, how do you believe people are born for greatness?
I believe it's 50-50. I believe we have free will, and you're forks in the road, and you can do certain things. You have to make choices. He stood up for his beliefs because he did that. Mm-hmm. No one made him do that. So I believe yes, but at the same time, we choose how to be. It just doesn't happen. Yeah. We have to make a choice. So I'm a little bit on the fence I'm a little bit nature nurture.
It's funny
You
because
know.
my dad, he always says there's people all over the world taking stands every day, but nobody knows their names, so you don't hear about it.
Right.
I had a platform, I had boxing, so it gave me a voice. And he knew that he was here for something special. He obviously came to Earth that way. He had a little extra something in his spirit, and he just came to the Earth that way. Like as Rockman shares, my dad used to wake up when he was a little boy. He had this inner knowing, a cognizant knowing, and he couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt like he was born to do big things in the world. And he would sit outside and look up to the stars and wait for a revelation, wait for God to speak to him. He would say, and I said, well, what happened? He said, well, I never heard nothing. So then his bike was stolen. He went on the path. And then people ask him, well, how do you get through life? How do you face these challenges and have such amazing strength even with his illness? And I remember he used to say that he was like an ant. And he said a lot of other ants know him and they follow him, so God gives him some extra strength. And that story, that came about because I discovered him outside one day when I was a teenager, and he was bent over, and he was out there for like 15 minutes. And I went upstairs, came back, and he was still out there. I was like, what is Daddy doing? So I went outside, and he was following a trail of ants. And that's when he said, see this long trail of ants? The majority of them have stopped. Some of them have ventured off, but the most of them are still following the ant at the head of the line. I'm like that ant. Lots of other ants know me. They follow me, so God gives me some extra strength.
Well, he did have incredible strength and was an incredible sportsman as well. We've talked about him being a loving father, husband, brother. We have a clip now of him as a fighter.
Everybody.
It's interesting he made that statement because George Foreman, to me, became a better man after that fight. He was a bully butch, couldn't handle anything, and then he became this loving teddy bear. And matter of fact, he's so healthy, he preserved his body, stopping the fight. And he's probably most successful financially with the Foreman grill. And my goodness, so quitting helped him out.
The clip that actually Claire uses in the film where my father's talking, he's jogging. You don't hear George's voice, but my father's talking to George on the phone. In 1979, my dad was in Texas, and he was driving around, and out of nowhere, just like a clip in a movie, he spotted George Foreman on a dirt lot, standing on a cardboard box, preaching to the people in the middle of nowhere. He got out the car, started talking to him, and they exchanged telephone numbers. George called my dad the following month, and Dad, of course, he's recording the conversation. And in that conversation, my dad is trying to convince George Foreman to come out of retirement and to come back and fight again, take back his title. And George is saying, no, I'm working for God now. I heard a voice, and he says, you come to the ring and you'll be fighting for God, So that was part of their conversation. She has the clip from.
We're going to throw the floor open for questions, so if you have any, please do start thinking of them. I just have a couple more, if that's okay. As this clip so well exhibits, the film has got an A soundtrack. How was, oh my goodness, how was that curated? How did that all come together?
Music is my thing, really, and the editor I work with, Reg Wrench, who I must say is a fantastic editor, and we made the film together, really. And he and I just love music, and he does loads and loads of pop promos for big name people. And so I thought, because I didn't want the film to be just in a chronological order, which is a bit boring, really, I thought I can flip back from different eras if I could use the music as a timeline. So when you've got the Jimi Hendrix track, or when you've got the Aretha Franklin track, or where you are. You're in Louisville in the 50s with the blues music, and so. That was the one thing that Hana thought, how's she going to do that as a white
Little
woman?
white lady got sold.
White lady,
Okay?
the music,
The music that's in this movie, I'm like, Claire, what?
That's the one thing I said to Mamie. I was like, how's she going to nail the music?
How did she know about this?
Because I was wondering whether you'd taken tracks that Muhammed, liked.
No, it's just for me. It's like an instinctive thing. I always edit to music, and the music is about the time. In this case, like placing where we are, but it's also the feel of the music. For instance, with the whole thing with George Foreman, when I interviewed him, I felt really bad because I was about to ask him, had a short period of time to interview him, what was your greatest defeat? I thought, how can I come up to this? But he was very, very humble about it and said, he was incredibly depressed. He never ever thought he was going to lose. Nobody thought he was going to lose. In fact, he said he'd never lost. Whereas he said with your father, he'd lost and he'd come back. And he didn't have that resilience. But that music, that B.B. King track, the Thriller Swan, it kind of just summed up that moment for me.
One of my favorite parts in the film is actually something footage that my dad isn't in, is the civil rights montage. Yeah. I don't know if you guys saw the movie yet, but the song, who is that singing?
It's going to sound really weird
It's a soulful
Yeah,
song.
it
I
is.
want to download
Yeah.
it, and it's just like it makes me just.
If I
it
say
brings
it sounds
chills.
stupid, it's basically the track is called "Is It Because I'm Black?"
Yeah,
So
it's a
yeah.
great
Yeah, yeah.
montage. The civil
Yeah.
rights montage is excellent.
She just nailed so much of like when we watch that film, it's like our dad's spirit is just oozing from it, like the little things that she didn't even know, like just the fact that there's a pink Cadillac flying down the street. He loved pink Cadillacs. To this day he wants a pink Cadillac because Sugar Ray Robinson, his idol, had a pink Cadillac, so he got one, you know, when he started fighting. But the fact that she did that, even I was like, wow, that was brilliant. So anyone in the family would know that, you know, but just because we know our father so well, so he's gonna love that.
It is so ambient and it's almost visceral. The tone of his voice and the timbre of it draws you in, and you feel like you know his character from the way it sounds and the way it feels. And everyone should see it, basically. Thank you, May, Hana, and Claire. It's been great. I think we've gone way over time, but this has been brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you also to everyone here at the Apple Store for organising this evening. Have a safe journey home.
Thank you.
Trying to persuade her to let me use some of them.
I had all these visions, you know, I was gonna make a documentary. I'm working on a book because there's like 90 hours of recordings that span like 6-7 years when he stopped boxing. So it was hard giving him up at first, but she showed me a clip of what she was doing, and it was done so beautifully and so well, and it had so much feeling and heart and just the spirit of my father in that little clip. I thought it was amazing. So
Your audio recordings make up what I would say it's kind of the spine of the film, and it's interesting because when I first saw them sort of coming onto the screen, you don't even realise that there's no moving pictures, there's nothing to see, because you're so engrossed in his voice, it's so impacting. Do you remember that from growing up, him having such command in his voice?
Yeah, I mean, my dad loved to tape and record us. I mean, he was fascinated by time and how fleeting it was, and history, and I mean, for him to be such a worldly figure and to really understand the importance of small moments with his children. And so I remember almost every recording in the film. I saw, oh my God, I remember that conversation with him. So we knew he loved that. He loved history, personal history.
he recorded us going to school.
So without further ado, I'd love to welcome onto the stage the internationally acclaimed award-winning director, Clare Lewins, Mariam Ali, and Hana Ali. Before we begin, I'd just like to say I watched the film last night and I loved it. I was so touched right from the very beginning, right from those first pieces of audio that you hear, those first images that you see, and it's moving. It's Ali, but in a way that we haven't seen him necessarily on screen. There's been a lot of films. What makes this different?
I think that this film, obviously, you know, Claire took a very personal approach, and so much has been done on our father, but no one's ever actually really focused on him as the man and the father. And she focused a lot on his family, his children, and that aspect. And then on top of that, she used a lot of footage to tell a story that most people take for granted that they've heard or learned, but we were watching footage that we had never seen before. And different stories in the film. We didn't know what went on behind the scenes, like the escort, and talking to the teachers. And we were in third grade, Layla and I, and talking to the boys we had crushes on. He recorded my mom on the telephone talking to his mother and his father, talking about his childhood and talking, recording. He just recorded everything. It was amazing.
Do you remember him recording? And did you ever ask why? Did you know why?
I remember there's recordings of myself, at 2 and 3, and saying, "Let me hold that thing, give me that thing," and trying to snatch it out of his hand. Or I want you to take this upstairs and let my mom hear me talking on this thing. So I remember certain things, but it was amazing to then have him give them to us and to listen to them and learn about all the other things that were going on in his life personally around the times we were just 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, playing around him on the floor, the things that he was struggling with, the decisions to come back to fight again, and trying to free hostages in Iran. The government's calling him because his name opened the lines of communication to the hostage crisis in 1979, and he's trying to prepare his speeches to the Ayatollah Khomeini to free the hostages, and he's recording all of that. He's recording, talking to different celebrities and playing practical jokes on different people, calling Joe Frazier, wishing him a happy Merry Christmas, and trying to convince George Foreman to come out of retirement, which he retired after he lost my father depressed, trying to convince him to come back to the ring and fight under him at his camp that he was trying to shoot, the famous shoot that he had. So we learned a lot, and May?
I mean, like Hana said, all the documentaries of my father have been about the sport, social activism. This documentary covered all those things, but he has 9 children, and he adores all 9 children. And most journalists and filmmakers really don't tap into that. So I just think it's a real comprehensive expression of him, and it really exudes his personality, his spirit, his soul. It just comes right off the screen. So. And a lot of people, what they get out of this film, it's been surprising that grown men will come out crying, saying, wow, the relationship between the father and the daughter, or the father and the child, is like nothing I've ever seen about an athlete. So Claire did a phenomenal job.
Claire, why did you choose to do this job? How did the wheels get set in motion? How did it come about?
A while ago, I did a series for the BBC about the best friend of people like Che Guevara and Muhammad Ali and Mick Jagger, and I always thought out of all those people there was something really special about Muhammad Ali, just something just really surprising. And I just thought if I could actually get to the people who knew him really well when in the inner circle, I could maybe find out what makes him so special.
And am I right in thinking that this all sort of began out of his birthday party, his 70th birthday party?
Well, I met Gene Kilroy, Ali's former business manager, as part of the series for the BBC, as I described, but he then said, well, Muhammad Ali is going to be 70, and why don't you come over and film his birthday party? And yeah.
She was actually working on the film a lot longer than that. That's when I met her, and that's where I did my first interview with her. And she filmed, I think she interviewed me 3 times, and that was the first one, and that's when she was introduced to the audio recordings. But I think 75% of your film was pretty done, wasn't it?
Well, I'd actually, by then I'd sort of been interviewing people like Mike Tyson and George Foreman, but the audio recordings were something I discovered that Hana had.
So you didn't realise that the audio recordings existed?
No, I was making the film without that anyway, because I thought if I could just get to the inner circle, then I'd have a different perspective. And the sort of the audio, but one thing that I really felt was important was to have Muhammad Ali's voice present through the film. And when I found out that you had this audio recording, that became me. No, I know, but it wasn't an easy fish to land, believe you me.